Hi everyone and welcome to Finish Your Plate. The rye bread. I've talked about it so many times and Finns love it. But the Finnish rye bread isn't the only kind of rye bread in the world. So when us Finns, when we talk about rye bread, you may think of other kinds of bread, like for example, the Jewish rye bread. So I thought it would be a good idea to show you what is the difference between Finnish rye bread and the Jewish rye bread. So join me and I'll show you exactly how those breads differ. So here I have a batch of Finnish rye bread, good looking rye bread that I baked myself. I cut it into squares, but certainly you can find it in all different kinds of shapes and sizes. Most often it's found in little round ones or maybe larger round ones with a hole in the middle. And now over here I went to my local bakery and got a couple of different kinds of rye breads that they had. So this is what most Americans would think when you say rye bread, especially when they think something like pastrami on rye. Very common here in the New York area, New York City area. But as we can see already by looking at this, this rye bread is very different from this rye bread. How are they both called rye breads? The Jewish rye bread, while it does have rye in it, it has mostly wheat in it. Unlike the Finnish rye bread, which is at least mostly rye bread. Sometimes you can find commercially made Finnish rye bread in Finland that also contains wheat, but the wheat is in minimal amounts. It will always contain mostly rye, and a lot of times it is 100% rye. And because of the lack of gluten in rye, that's why you get this flatter kind of a bread rather than a big loaf like what I have here. And that's really the main difference of adding wheat into the dough, is to produce that great rise, which of course you don't get from here. This one is seeded rye, so it has caraway seeds on top, as we can see. Caraway is sometimes used in Finnish rye bread, not very often. Finns know caraway as kumina, not to be confused with cumin, even though they sound very much alike. Caraway in Finnish is kumina. So caraway is added to rye bread, kind of to relieve the stress for the stomach for the added fiber that the rye brings, which I think is kind of funny because Finns eat 100% rye bread with ton of fiber without caraway at all. Or maybe we're just used to the high fiber content more. Of course, caraway is also added for additional flavor. And if caraway is added to Finnish rye bread, you're probably not going to find it on top like here on the rye bread, but rather it's going to be baked into the rye. Also, I have here some marble rye and some pumpernickel rye. Pumpernickel rye is kind of interesting because I often use pumpernickel rye flour for my rye bread. It really produces nice Finnish rye bread. But again, we can see that the results are very different. So let's cut these breads open and let's compare what it looks like inside. So first and most obvious thing, when we look at the crumb, the Finnish rye bread has this really coarse crumb to it. That's because I used rye meal to make this rye bread. Of course, over a couple of days, it will kind of even out and become a little bit more homogeneous, but really that is a pretty standard freshly baked rye bread kind of a texture. And also, the texture is still a little bit moist, a little bit wet. We can feel it a little tacky on the touch. Of course, these breads could be a little bit older because Even though I picked them up from the bakery, they may have been baked even several hours before I picked them up. Then if we look at the seeded rye, we can see that this one has a texture which is very similar to your regular wheat bread. Actually, by just looking at it, except for the seeds on top, you may not be able to tell the difference. And the pumpernickel rye, of course, the name says pumpernickel because it contains some of that rye flour in it. But I also suspect that they have added something here as a coloring, because just looking at the crumb alone, it's not that much pumpernickel flour in here to really make it so deep brown color. It has a deeper brown color than my rye bread. So they may have added something like, sometimes people add things like even coffee into the mixture to give it that really deep brown color. So then we have this marble rye, which is basically a mixture of both the seeded rye and the pumpernickel. It's just been baked into kind of like together. So you can kind of see the veins of the marble rye inside the bread, which makes it a pretty impressive looking, for sure. So let's give these breads a taste. Let's cut up a slice and see how do they differ in taste. Of course, we all know how Finnish rye bread tastes like, so I'll save that last. It has a very sour tang to it compared to, let's see. Yeah. I feel like the Finnish rye bread has a little bit more of that toasty kind of a grain, kind of a flavor or smell to it, whereas this rye bread has almost a pungent kind of aroma, almost vinegary aroma that you get. And of course the caraway seeds baked into the bread also give their distinctive aroma. And let's take a look at the pumpernickel here. I'm hard pressed to find a difference in the smell except for caraway. I feel like these have exactly the same kind of a smell, probably taste too. I would expect if a bread is this brown that it would have a little bit more of that toastiness, those toasty notes that come specifically from rye. Let's give it a taste. This is pretty much mass-produced bread though. This is not artisan rye bread, so that could definitely make a difference. The first thing that hits you when you taste the rye bread is that taste of caraway. Those seeds of caraway, as you chew into them, they're gonna burst in flavor. And as you chew it more and more, you get more of that sour, the tanginess of the sourdough bread. Let's taste the pumpernickel rye. The pumpernickel, oddly enough, I feel like it has less flavor than this one, but that's only because of the caraway. It is maybe not quite as sour too, but even from the texture, we can see that this has mostly wheat in it, just because you cannot produce that kind of a gluten texture, this kind of a crumb, with just plain rye flour. It just does not happen. So let's now take a piece of the Finnish rye bread. You can feel the fiber in it because it is just ton of fiber in that bread. You can feel it when you chew. It's a little bit more work to chew it too because of the fiber, but it definitely leaves that feeling of fullness that you get from just like a whole grain bread. So as far as toppings go though, the Finnish rye bread is going to be hardier. The bread is going to carry more flavor. It's going to carry a little bit more substance. Whereas with the Jewish rye bread, like I said, pastrami or corned beef on rye, that's a super, super common combination, especially here in New York. I think it might be interesting to try corned beef or pastrami on Finnish rye bread. Add a little bit mustard, and I think you might have a nice sandwich going. But most often how Finns eat their sandwich, it's not a stack sandwich, it's an open-faced sandwich. So at most what we do is put one slice of cheese, one slice of ham perhaps, or maybe two slices of some kind of salami just to cover the whole bread and then eat it as is. Or maybe even just put some butter or spread on the bread. And oftentimes Finns love to eat their rye bread at a meal, whether it's soup, whether it's just any kind of dish, a side of rye bread, even if there's nothing really to soak up or to mop up like many cultures use the bread for. Finns still like to have their rye bread, either rye bread like this or rye crisp bread. Tradition starts all the way from schools. When you have school lunches, there's always going to be bread. When you go to the army, because remember Finns have to serve in the army, there's the same thing in the army. At every meal there's going to be either fresh rye bread or rye crisp bread as a side. So Finns kind of grow into it, loving their rye bread, which then is no surprise that when Finns move out of the country, overseas perhaps, like here in the US, and they really miss their rye bread. And the rye bread is really unique kind of a rye bread compared to any other culture. I'm not sure if any other country has rye bread quite like this. Of course, the Germans have rye bread that is very similar to this, but it's still a little bit different enough that for many Finns, it is just no substitute to this kind of a rye bread. So let me know in the comments, have you tried the Jewish rye bread? What kind of rye bread is your favorite? If you're not from the US, what kind of rye bread do you have in your area? Is it similar to the Finnish rye bread, or is it similar to the American Jewish rye bread? And don't forget to like and subscribe, because that always helps my videos. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time on Finish Your Plate.